News now on Sky News Live, and joining me for our political panel is former Liberal Party leader John Hewson in our Canberra studio, and Bruce Hawker from Hawker Britain is here with me in the Sky News Centre. Welcome to you. Bruce, I know you've been in the United States. Unfortunately, we won't get to Donald Trump today and what's happening with the transition, but we will talk about that another day.
We've got 4 years of that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. I do want to talk about, to both of you, John Hewson, I'll start with you. The Treasurer's response to this worse than expected September quarter GDP figure yesterday, he said the Parliament must come together and virtually push through his agenda. He also is talking about more productive debt to produce, to be invested into infrastructure, but also, again, pushing that his business corporate tax cut plan over 10 years should be supported. Do you support that? Is that convincing as a response?
Look, I don't think the corporate tax cut is going to work the way they imagine. The bulk of the benefit will either go to a handful of very large companies in Australia or offshore. It won't trickle down to wages and employment the way they imagine. And quite frankly, we can't afford it. But I do strongly support the idea of infrastructure spending. I mean, the government has been basically underfunding infrastructure spending. I'd like to see them embrace an infrastructure bond, get away from this simplistic notion of good debt, bad debt, all debt is bad. Let's have a distinction there, use infrastructure debt.
Yes, the distinction is that it's productive. Sorry, John, that it produces income-producing things for Australia.
That's right. They can be productively employed so that the net economic and social benefits over time will actually not only, service the debt, but give us a real boost to national productivity. All
right, Bruce Hawker, do you think this is a good response?
I think John Hewson's response is a good one. I don't think the Treasurer's is, for the same reasons I think that John's enunciated. Deficit was at last count 37 billion. It had blown out from 10 billion in the first year of the government out to 16, and now 37 billion and growing. It seems like a very curious way to deal with that sort of a problem by increasing the deficit dramatically. I mean, that's a $50 billion tax cut you're talking about that has to be found somewhere, and out of other programs or through other cuts. So I don't think it'll hold, and he'd be better off just moving on to to doing the significant nation-building projects that people actually ultimately recognise and reward in governments.
And will produce jobs.
And will produce jobs.
John Hewson, you mentioned in the first part of your answer that you don't think the business tax cut will work in the way they are saying it will work. Even their own figures, or Treasury's own figures, estimates that over, 2 decades, it will only produce a 1% increase in economic growth.
That's right. I mean, those numbers, I think, are pretty solid. There have been a number of forecasting groups now, modelling groups, that have actually come to similar conclusions. And, I think the reality of the budget repair task is such that they don't have any leeway in the near term anyway. I mean, there's about $100 billion that's got to be found over the next 4 years to bring the budget back to surplus. They've made a net gain of about $10 billion in what they've done so far. They've got a very long way to go, and they're pretending they can do it by cutting expenditure rather than or increasing revenue. Of course, they obviously have to look at increasing revenue, and they're maintaining this fiction that they can do it all on the expenditure side. And, the AAA rating is under threat.
Yeah, all right. I do want to move to another subject, and that's been one of the big talking points this week, and it's really been the backflip, I guess, on even having a discussion about an emissions intensity scheme as part of the review on climate change policy. John Hewson, you're shaking your head. I mean, Minister Josh Frydenberg put it on the table on Monday. By Tuesday night and yesterday, it was taken off the table, but the review is staying. Do you think this is sensible policy making?
We're having a repeat of what we had last year with the tax package. All options are on the table. Then one by one, all options are off the table. If you're going to have a review and then constrain the review to exclude some of the most potentially significant policy initiatives, I mean, it's a waste of time having an internal review of that just to confirm what you've been doing. I mean, it was Einstein that defined insanity as doing more of the same day in, day out and expecting different results. They've got to think outside the square, and right now the energy crisis that is emerging in this country is very real. The states are actually starting, as you saw with Jay Weatherall's statements today, they're starting to lead this debate because there's a vacuum in leadership on climate change and energy and so on at the national level.
Bruce Hawker, it is interesting because even the government's own hand-picked chief scientist, Alan Finkel, according to the Fin Review today, he is set to push or urge the emissions intensity scheme as being the precise answer that the government needs to reduce power prices. He is arguing that it's not going to be a tax, it is not a carbon price.
You know, well, science particularly seems to be taking a back seat when you talk about climate change all the time. You know, we are constantly listening to people who are motivated by other considerations, generally political, and pandering to a certain group, either in their own political party or in the community, rather than listening to the scientists who tell you overwhelmingly that this is a massive issue that has to be dealt with and has to be dealt with now. And of course, you know, the government is continually pretending to deal with the issue and then running away as soon as there's any sign of a resistance from, particularly from the right wing of the Liberal Party. So I think it's a problem which is not going to be resolved by this government. I'm certain about that. Turnbull has made it quite clear that he is unwilling, unprepared and too scared to stand up to the right wing of his party. And what
so you think it has been a capitulation to some of those voices on the right,
for
particularly
sure
Corey
it has.
Bernardi?
Absolutely, absolutely. They are the empty vessels that are driving this ship.
All right, but isn't the government, by doing that, also effectively pitting Labor in a very different light for the next election? They say they'll be, Liberals say they'll be the party of low electricity prices, of definite supply, and they're saying that Bill Shorten will be the party of renewables and uncertain supply.
Well, they're certainly going to have a debate about renewable energy and continue to have that debate and not just roll over every time there's a problem with a transmitter in South Australia or Victoria. That's a very important debate to have. Labor has to be prepared to stand up and fight on that issue. It's a tough one because a lot of people just have a knee-jerk reaction to these issues. Oh, it's going to cost more. Well, you know, ultimately our planet, is going to be the big loser in this, and an older generation is just not listening to that problem because, frankly, they don't see it as being something that they're going to have to deal with. Their children and their grandchildren will.
John Hewson, you've looked at this issue a lot. Do you what is your view of an emissions intensity scheme? Because it's been explained through the Grattan Institute, and as we understand, Professor Finkel, the chief scientist who was appointed by the government, is saying that this is not a carbon tax, it's not a carbon price, but it is a way to, in fact, reduce prices.
Look, the government is quite hypocritical about carbon pricing. I mean, the direct action auction system that they're using to buy emissions reductions is putting a price on carbon. Whether they like it or not, they have a carbon pricing system already. And if we've got a more effective way of bringing these coal-fired power stations to account by charging them for the intensity of their emissions, I really think that makes eminent sense. And I'm not surprised that Alan Finkel is going to lead the way on this from within government. But, you know, where's the leadership among the political leaders of the government? That's not there. They're letting the issue drift. And our electricity prices, they're going up anyway. Gas prices are now running to a point where gas-intensive industries like APM, a paper mill that employs 6,000 people in the Latrobe Valley, is under real threat right now because of the cost of the gas. I mean, they've got no solutions. They're banning new exploration of conventional gas. They're banning coal seam gas. Most of the gas that's generated in Australia is exported.
Well,
I mean, there is no integrated policy here.
Yeah, and even some of the energy suppliers, the business people, want certainty. They at least want a discussion about this. Energy Australia Chairman, Ms Tanner, she wants a discussion at least of all these options. John
That's right.
Hewson.
I mean, you should be having a full-blown debate of these options.
All right, Bruce Hawker, do you think how we end up the year, round out the year, Parliament finished last week, a little bit messy with the backpacker tax. How would you assess Bill Shorten's performance?
Well, he came within a whisker of winning an election which none of us thought he had a real prospect of winning. Now, to some extent, that was because of the way in which Malcolm Turnbull has continued to disappoint remarkably both the right and the left in Australian politics. That's quite an achievement. I mean, most people just upset one or the other. He's managed to do it to both sides of the political spectrum, both ends of the political spectrum. So he is definitely the big loser in this last 12 months. I've got absolutely no doubt about that. And frankly, the way in which he's gone about doing things in the last few weeks makes you wonder, whether there are people inside the Liberal Party now who are just starting to wonder whether, he really has got what it takes to lead them into the future, because he doesn't stand for anything. That's his problem. And the Australian public's worked that out, and his own party's worked that out, and more importantly, Bill Shorten has too.
All right, 10 seconds, John Hewson, for a response to that. Malcolm Turnbull's performance during the year, briefly.
Well, I think it continues to disappoint relative to the expectations that were created when he took over the job.
All right.
I mean, he came with great expectations and he's failed to deliver on every front.
Gentlemen, we will have to leave it there. John Hewson, Bruce Hawker, great to speak to you both. Thank you.